Hey guys, today we're going to be walking you through making a bracer pattern. This is probably going to be one of the more simple pattern making videos that we make, so it's a great place to start if you've never made a pattern before. You're not going to need a whole lot in the way of tools, you just need material to make the pattern out of, which I usually use poster board. Most of my patterns that I have lying around are still just made out of this poster board, unless I know I'm going to use it like 1,000 times, and I'll usually get some kind of plastic for it. You'll need something to punch holes for, where we're going to line up where our connective material is, like what's supposed to simulate rivets. You're going to need a tape measure because we're going to make this to your measurements. You'll need a pair of scissors for cutting in and out, a pin obviously to make some marks, and then some type of straight edge. A ruler works fine, but I prefer to use squares to keep all my angles nice and tight. But the first thing we're going to need to do is take some measurements, because like I said, we're going to make a bracer, so it's going to be fitting on your forearm. So you need 3 measurements for the forearm sizing, and it's basically a glorified tube, which is really why this is the best place to start with pattern making, because you don't have to go over some crazy angle, across the shoulder or something like that, and it doesn't have to accommodate a whole lot of motion because it just sits here on your forearm. So the 3 measurements you're going to need is a wrist circumference, which is around this part, a larger part of the forearm circumference down here, and then a length of the forearm, which is from here to here. What I usually like to do is just bend my arm because you don't want it to catch on any of the parts that do move. So basically measure from here to here. And so just wrap around nice and tight in each spot, and you can write down on your poster board what your different measurements you get, just so you keep track of it. All right, once you got your measurements taken, we're going to make a symmetrical bracer. So the easiest way to do that is to take your poster board and go ahead and fold it in half. And we're going to make all of our marks on just one side of it, so that when we open up the poster board, it's going to be the same on each side. But keep your measurements out on the outside, so you don't have to keep opening it up to look at your measurements for reference. All right, so once you got your poster board folded in half, we're going to use this top edge as the wrist portion. So my wrist measurement was 6.5. So I'm going to measure in half of that circumference measurement, which in my case is 3.25. And I'm just going to make a little mark. And then I'm going to measure down this fold the measurement that is the length of the forearm that I took. And mine was 11. It was actually closer to 12, but I'm going to go ahead and mark it at 11 just to give me a little bit of extra space. I don't need full coverage. Some of that just kind of depends on the style of bracer, whether you want to look really heavily armored and covered, or if you want to look a little lighter and mobile. Then from that mark, I'm going to do the same thing I did with my wrist and measure in, away from the fold, half of the circumference of the larger part of my forearm. And now I've basically just got these 3 little marks on here, and I'm going to play connect the dots. This is one of those points where having the square rather than a straight edge helps you a lot, so you can line it up and get it perfectly straight. Then from dot to dot. So when you've connected the dots, what you end up having is kind of this lopsided rectangle or some type of trapezoid type deal. And once we've got those lines on there, we can go ahead and cut it out. Again, we're doing this with everything, or all these steps with it folded, so that once we open it up, we've got a symmetrical piece. All right, in your most simplistic terms, voila, you've got a bracer pattern. Most of the time, you probably would not really need my help to make this simple of a bracer pattern, but for a base pattern, this is something you might want to keep around, especially if you're like a cosplayer and you make several different costumes a year, and like 3 of them are going to be armor suits or some type of armor. Then it's good to have a couple base pattern pieces around, because like, for example, your forearm doesn't really change size that much. And so like once you decide you're going to do this other character, if you're going to start out by making a pair of bracers, you can always pull your base pattern bracer piece out, and it's a good place to start. But when you wrap this around your forearm, it should more or less take up the whole space that is your forearm. It's going to be a little blocky and clunky because your forearm isn't exactly the a symmetrical tube, but it should be pretty close. All right, so now that you got your trapezoid cut out, kind of like so, if you wanted to just have a plain, like simplistic Viking or rugged looking piece of armor, or if you're, in the live steel fighting realm and you're going to make this out of 16-ounce leather and just wrap it around your forearm and call it a bracer, then you're all set. But we're going to go ahead and give it a little more design flair and make it a bit more interesting looking, because for the most part we do costuming, not really protective stuff. So if that's what you're into, this is what we're going for. So the next thing we're going to do is put some detailing on it. I kind of like swooping angles myself, a little bit like a elvish look, or like Persian Gothic if you're historical. But you want to make sure, because we're doing our symmetrical style bracer, that all of these markings are still with it folded in half. I'm going to go for some swooping lines. Probably make it, let's say, 3 panels. Obviously you can do more, you can do less, but this to me makes it a good comfortable size for each panel. So with these lines drawn on here, these are basically going to be each individual pieces. So we're going to cut this apart, and then we're going to add the seam allowance to it, so that they're going to be able to have some meat when they overlap to hook them together. Because obviously if we were to cut this out as is and then slide it down so that they overlapped each other, once we connected them together, what you would end up doing would be losing height of the bracer, which would make it quite a bit smaller. We're going to have to overlap it about 1/2 inch or so. So once we hook all this together, looking at it two-dimensionally, it's going to look a little bit like this, but what we're actually going to do is shift the panels. Well, they're going to look like this when we set it up, but we're going to add material top so that the panel will be able to sit down on top of our additional material. All right, so the easiest way to line up our seam allowance, like I said, we're going to need about 1/2 inch, because we're going to be hooking ours together with rivets. If you were stitching these together, then you wouldn't really need a whole 1/2 inch, but it's material you're going to be overlapping anyway. Nobody's going to see it. It's going to be on the back. So to me, that's kind of one of those better safe than sorry things. You leave a little bit more and you don't have to worry about it like slipping off the edge or not having enough to mount one piece to the other. If you're really on a budget and how much material you're using is a big issue, then you're skirting around the 1/2 inch. You might be able to get away with 3/8, but for the most part, I'd say 1/2 inch is probably your safest bet. So the easiest way to get seam allowance added to this is basically we're going to put it back on the fold. Remember how we folded our poster board to get our symmetry? We're going to join the pattern piece we just cut away with the fold back like so. And we're going to need seam allowance on the top because this next piece is going to overlap this one. So we're going to retrace this entire pattern piece, like so. And then we're going to slide it up roughly 1/2 inch. Like I said, I would err on the side of having more rather than less. And then we'll retrace the top angle again. You're going to have to add just a little bit more because this line comes out a little past the pattern piece. But this little shadow line lets you know where the original piece is going to go, like where the next piece is going to butt up to. And then this is your seam allowance. All right, and so this piece sits here, the next one sits on top of it, like that. So then you're going to have to do the same thing with the next one. Now this piece, this can get confusing, especially if you've got a pattern that's got like 32 pieces or something like that, because now you have this piece and you have this piece, which are basically the same piece. So usually I'll just throw these things away, just so I don't have them accumulating and bound to confuse me later. This is now piece number 1. It's a finished pattern piece. And then we're going to do the same thing with our next piece. Now the bottom of this one overlaps the top here. So we don't have to add seam allowance on the bottom of this one, but the next piece overlaps this one. So we're going to have to, again, put seam allowance on the top. So we do the same method a second time, move it up about 1/2 inch, retrace that top, make sure it's good and snug. Kind of moved on me. And then I just fill in where I know it's going to go. So there's the seam. I call these shadow lines because you're not actually going to see them on the workpiece, but it lets you know how far to slide the next pattern piece down to before you put your holes in it to make it line up. Now this piece, this goes on the very top. When we're overlapping these, they're cascading down. So this is going to be the outermost piece, which means it only overlaps on the bottom, and on the top it's just the end of the piece. Now it's straight cut across the top though, so which, you know, some people like that, but for me personally, because I have all these swooping angles already, I would rather continue that theme of swooping angles. So I'm going to go ahead and redo this pattern piece as well. Remember, that's number 2, and this is number 3. So I'm going to retrace the whole thing. This is the part that overlaps the second pattern piece, and this is my original. But I want some type of interesting swooping angle, so I'm going to mirror kind of this curve on the bottom and go up to a point, like so. So now this is number 3. And these, my originals, can just go away. Alright, so now that I've got all these laid out, I can go ahead and cut them out. And I want to make sure to do that with them folded as well. That way when I open them back up, we're going to have that nice symmetrical kind of style. Alright, now when I open all these things up and I line them up with the shadow lines, each one should overlap on the seam allowance instead of having to slide it up or slide it down to find purchase. Now the only thing that's going to be a little bit off about it is that because I kind of fudged the lines to continue up, you're going to have this little bit here, which a lot of times I'll just trim off. Sometimes I'll just leave it knowing it's going to be there, and I adjust for it when I cut out the actual material. But there we have our finished pieces. Now all we have to do is lay out the holes to connect one to the other, and that'll be pretty much it. There are several different ways you can attach these things. You know, you can plan on gluing them together, especially if you're using EVA foam or plastic for your armor medium. If you're doing leather, a lot of times people like to stitch them. Like I said, if you're doing the stitching, you don't necessarily need quite as much seam allowance, but again, you don't see it, it's on the back. Most of the time I end up using rivets, especially for leather work. A lot of times with the ABS plastic and EVA foam, I'll still sometimes put a additional rivet like on the ends, just to help support my glue, just because I don't really like holding things with just glue. I feel like that's a recipe for having a very temporary costume. But for, like with most mediums, the place where two adhered panels start to come apart is usually at one of the extremities. So you always want to plan on putting one of your joiners at least on each extremity, which in this case would be the center and each corner. So in these 3 points, now you can put a lot more in there if you just want the hardware look, but I have several pairs of leather bracers, one of which was one of the first pieces I ever made that were just held together with a rivet in each extremity, 3 per row kind of thing. So what I'm going to do is, now knowing that I need the rivets in these individual locations, I'm going to go ahead and punch these holes. And you can use just a paper hole puncher that you can get at Walmart. You know, they cost like $3 or whatnot, but they usually punch much larger holes, so there's a little bit of margin for error. So me personally, knowing that I'm going to put a rivet shaft through here, I like to use a hole puncher that gives me a rivet shaft size. And again, we're going to do this with it folded in half, so that we know we're getting the hole in the exact same spot on each side. Do keep in mind there that with the center, because when you open it up it's going to double, if you punch the hole off to the side, then you're going to open up with 2 holes, and so you want 1 hole. So what you really want to do is just nip off that seam. Basically, you just want it to cut off where the fold itself is. So when you open it up, you've got your holes laid out symmetrically. And you're going to want to do that with the pieces that are on top first. So the overlapping parts, not the parts that have the seam allowance, because this is the part you're going to see. The seam allowance is all going to be hidden. So if it's slightly off on the seam allowance and not particularly symmetrical, nobody's ever going to know, as long as it's symmetrical on the outside where everybody's seeing. So once you get those holes laid out, then you can overlap it with these shadow lines that you left on here. And once you line that up, then you know where the hole needs to be to join it. So I mark through the hole I just made. A little trickier on the fold. But then, when you punch that hole, you know that it's going to line up. And then one more time for the top piece. Line up the shadow line. Mark through the hole. Doesn't have to be much of a mark, just enough to let you know where it is. Punch those. So now these holes should line up perfectly. Now if you just want your finished pattern, you're pretty much done, but for me personally, especially if I'm making very complicated patterns, maybe not so much with this pair of bracers, but my first armor suit, for example, all kinds of articulated parts, I was kind of doing a lot of stuff by trial and error, so I found that if you can go ahead and build all of your patterning and assemble it with these little guys, these little brads, which are great for simulating rivets. They're about the same cap diameter. Then if you can move around in a armor suit made out of poster board without tearing the poster board or tearing a brad out of the side or whatnot, then you've sized it really well. You've planned on your articulation really well. And that is a recipe for not having chafing and limited range of motion once you actually make the final piece. So if you're new at making patterns, I suggest go ahead and just assemble it and make sure everything lines up well, it moves well without tearing anything. That way you know you're bound to have a good finished project once you move it to the actual medium that would be a lot more expensive to actually mess up on. You know, if you mess up on some poster board, no big deal, you chop it up, you do some more. Yeah. Alright, and there we have it. There's our bracer pattern. Now to do the closures, there's lots of different ways you could put the closures on there, which you don't really need a patterning class for that. You know, if you want to put some D-rings on there, use 2 D-rings and a strap to vise it together. You can do the tried and true, just put holes down each side and lace them together like a shoe, especially if you've got something to set eyelets or something to make it look really finished. Then you can put buckles and straps. You mount a buckle on one side and a strap on the other. Same general concept as the D-rings, just with a little more permanence. The D-rings seem to slip a little bit over time. But yeah, that's pretty much it. If you'd like to see more videos like this, we'll probably be doing more patterning ones that kind of increase in complexity as we go. So keep an eye on our channel, and we'll see you next time.